Hi, I'm Julia Kirchie, representing the McGill Journal of Sustainable Development Law. We are excited to share with you a recorded webinar with Dr. Maya Prabhu on the topic of climate migration and legal and mental health considerations that we hosted this past November. Please feel free to check out our YouTube channel for previously recorded presentations, as well as our Facebook page at McGill Journal of Sustainable Development Law for upcoming webinars. Thank you and enjoy.
So today we have an amazing guest, Dr. Prabhu. I'll give a brief introduction, but she's just so impressive that it might just be a lengthy one. But she obtained her medical degree from Dalhousie Medical School and completed residency training in adult psychiatry and completed a fellowship in forensic psychiatry at Yale. So love that. Between medical school and residency, she graduated from here, McGill Law, which is incredible. Like, that timing is amazing. And she then practiced litigation at Davis Polk Wardwell in New York. And she was a deputy counsel with the Independent Inquiry Commission, which investigated allegations of fraud and corruption in the UN Oil for Food program. Amazing. So she's currently a consulting forensic psychiatrist to the state of Connecticut and provides opinions on high-risk cases, including persons found not guilty by reasons of insanity. She testifies regularly in state and federal court and before the Psychiatry Security Review Board. She consults with legal organizations with regard to psychological impact of lawyering and collaborative representation of clients with mental illness. And her research areas of interest are forensic psychiatry, refugee mental health, climate migration, and issues at the nexus of health and international law. So we're really, really grateful to have you here, Professor Prabhu, and we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for everybody who's joined, and McGill Journal of Sustainable Development Law, which I was there for the opening when I was at McGill Law and the founding of it. So thank you so much for the invitation. It is always nice to return home, sort of metaphorically. And I have to say, for all of you guys who I can see on video in the library, it's evoking some student nostalgia. I'm happy not to go back to that time cramming for exams, but it's nice to see you. So good luck, because there's always a lot to do. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen now, put up my PowerPoint. You do not have an obligation to, please do not be diligent law students and try to master this material. Really, I use the PowerPoint to keep me organized, and I'm going to put a lot of ideas on the table because I don't know where your interests lie. Please feel free to put questions into chat as they come up, even if I don't get to them right away. I'm really curious to know where your thoughts are. I thought I would talk about legal and mental health considerations with regard to climate migration. And literally every slide could be an hour presentation into itself. So as I said, I'm going to throw a lot of ideas onto the table, and I'll let your questions at the end decide where we go in discussion. So I have to say that this work for me, my interest in scholarship in climate migration actually grew out of work that I was doing with resettled refugees. So into people who had been accepted for the official refugee resettlement program in the US, and I provided mental health care for them. And it sort of emerged naturally about the stories that I was hearing and growing scholarship in them. I think it's very interesting that how much attention there has been to the issue of climate migration in the last few years. For a 1990 intergovernmental report on the very first IPCC report actually noted that the single greatest impact of climate change could be on migration. But it took over 20 years before climate displacement became part of climate negotiations and in the climate documents. It was really an almost very quiescent 20 years in scholarship. And then if you just look at the headlines over the last 4 years or so, it's really exploded in interest. And you know, it's sort of interesting. A lot of these headlines and all the public attention to it is in part, I think, driven as people experience changes in weather themselves, changes in climate events, and they can see the impact of what it might mean in a much more personal way. And you'll notice that these headlines often really focus on what it means for people who are in countries. So what does it mean for housing? What does it mean for costs? What does it mean for how we're going to live? There's a lot of public focus on what I call security issues, the concern that it might lead to resource conflicts, even taxes. So, and this has also been an interesting overlay with a lot of the social justice movements and activism, thinking about climate migration in terms of the sort of colonial and the racial dimension of it. One thing also that I sort of thought a lot about why there's so much attention to climate migration now. And I think it's also because in the last few years, maybe because we're all sitting at home with COVID and just staring at our screens and phones and TVs, is that people are keenly aware that what the IPCC report of 2018 correctly forecast was that it's not just that we're going to have more extreme weather events, but the infrequency of them is going to increase, and they will happen simultaneously. So these are photos just from 1 month, I think, last summer in the US, where we had wildfires, flooding in Louisiana, and extreme temperatures. That photograph was taken in Arizona. So I think people are living the experience of these dramatic extreme events and thinking about what it means for their lifestyle. And I also think that the numbers that you will often see in headlines and newspaper stories are really dramatic. So published estimates of the numbers of persons who might be displaced by climate change and related phenomena, you will hear numbers anywhere from 50 million to 1 billion people. Probably the most commonly cited number is about 200 million, and that's forecast on projections by a researcher named Norman Myers in 95 and 2000. And even he's acknowledged then that those extrapolations might be, had sort of unreliable data. I put this slide up here in particular because if you're interested in this topic, you really should read the Groundswell report, World Bank 2018 report, which did, I thought, really good climate modeling. And it sort of acknowledged that how much risk and exposure and displacement that will occur is going to depend on the degree on the climate trajectory. So depending on how bad the climate scenarios are, you may see greater displacement. But the Groundswell report sort of, and its worst case scenario, estimated that 143 million people are going to be internally displaced, so staying within borders, making movements within borders across 3 regions, so Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. So those numbers are really dramatic. And I'm sort of curious to know, and I'm going to look for answers in the chat, whether people feel like these are familiar numbers, totally novel concepts, whether they've also seen the newspaper headlines. You'll let me know in the chat and I'll sort of respond. There's a lot to say about how climate migration is covered, and I will sort of draw a difference between the kind of photographs and headlines that come up with climate migration, which I think are still considerably less racialized than photos that we saw in the last few years, like these photos of the so-called migrant crisis, the border crisis, which I think are much more disturbing in terms of their portrayal of individuals who are making these journeys. As I said, much less racialized, I think much less xenophobic. You might remember these photos from 2016 to sort of 18, describing the European, so-called European migrant crisis. I'm not saying that the coverage isn't less alarmist, it's sort of noting that the tone strikes me as slightly different. So what are we going to try to cover in this talk? I wanted to discuss a little bit of who is a climate migrant, what do we mean by the term climate migrant, talk a little bit about the legal considerations. I may do a little less of that up front, depending on your interests. I wanted to cover health considerations, particularly mental health considerations, because as a psychiatrist, it's basically my intellectual home. And then thinking a little bit about responses and inviting your thoughts about all of the above. So let's just sort of begin with climate migrant and with me, because we're going to go through a little bit of terminology, but I think it's useful for you to understand why it's such a nebulous term, and that has relevance for the legal issues that arise. So let's begin with the term migrant. So this is sort of a definition not enshrined in law per se, but the sort of working universal IOM definition of a person who's moved across a border or within a state, so away from his habitual place of residence, right? So that's sort of consistent with our lay understanding of somebody who's away from home, whatever home is for them. And that's why I actually began by asking you where you are from and what migrant journeys you or people in your families may have. To adapt a question that I've heard Francois Crépeau ask of his audiences, how many of you listening today were born in the place where your parents were born? So put an answer in the chat. How many of you were born in a place where your parents were born? And my suspicion, because I'm speaking, I think, to a largely Canadian audience at the moment, is probably not. Very few of you were. Which that tells me a little bit about your parents. They've completed a migrant or a journey themselves. Maybe it was for work, maybe it was because of more catastrophic circumstances. And the point of my even having you think about that question is to say that migration is very much a human behavior, that we tend to see it, that when we talk about the climate crisis or border crisis or immigration crisis or refugee crisis, we tend to see it as a catastrophic, singular, unusual event. But I think it would be helpful if we realize that movement, particularly internally within countries, is kind of the human norm. We're a migratory species, and thinking about movement and migration as a thing that people do for any number of reasons might be useful, rather than thinking of this in terms of crises that we need to sort of manage, but rather flows that we can predict and perhaps shape a little bit. I contrast the term migrant with a displaced person, which implies somebody who might be forced to flee their home. So the concept of migration sort of encompasses the idea that maybe the migrant has had a little bit more agency, possibly. Maybe they've been able to anticipate it, unlike somebody who's moving in a more catastrophic situation, which takes us to the sort of standard environmental migrant definition. So again, not enshrined in international law, but the kind of working definition of the Institute of Migration, which is that environmental migrants are persons or groups of persons who, for compelling reasons of sudden progressive changes in their environment, make them obliged to leave their homes or choose to do so either temporarily, permanently within their country or abroad. And if you're thinking to yourself, that's a very dense definition or it covers a lot of scenarios, you're absolutely right. So an environmental migrant could be somebody who's inside their country, who's moved outside of their country. It could be a permanent or temporary. It could be forced or it could be planned. So as you can imagine, that's a potentially very large group of people. And there are sub-definitions of it, right? It could be a person who's had to flee to an environmental disaster. So a typhoon and your home is destroyed and your village is flooded. It could be somebody who anticipates that the land is drying up, the herds are dying, you can't plant your crops, so you're going to make a move to a city. So it could be somebody who's planning in advance. Or it can be somebody who is seeing a far off change, right? A tiny island state is slowly sinking, and I'm going to follow in the pathways of my friends and or family members and choose to move to work as an urban laborer somewhere else. So then it's one step beyond environmental migrant to climate migrant, right? So think of climate migrants as a subset of environmental migrants. So individuals who are forced to flee in response, particularly to sea level changes, extreme weather events, water and drought scarcity. So we're thinking about specific climate-specific events that are driving people. And I just put up all those other terms at the top because there's a very complex terminology. It varies across scholars, it varies across disciplines. For the purposes of my talk, I'm going to use the term climate migrant, and we can talk about why later, but I'll use that as my shorthand. I think one legal consensus in the scholarship is that the term climate refugees, which you're certainly going to see in headlines and you're certainly going to see here in casual conversation, is really not the ideal term to use. You'll be familiar with the idea that the notion of a refugee is actually defined of art from the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees. This concept of of a refugee was developed after World War II, by thinking about the large numbers of people who were displaced after the war. And you'll see that the concept of what we call a convention refugee or a conventional refugee is based on the idea of persecution because of any number of one of these prongs. So you're being persecuted by your home country on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, social group, or politics, and you're outside of your home country because you can't avail yourself of the protections that the state is supposed to offer you. So you'll notice climate is not in this definition, and I'll anticipate a question or a comment that there's often in the lay media, there's a lot of focus on why not just open up the convention to climate refugees. And I think for those of us who either work with refugees or are legal scholars who are very concerned about refugee rights, the consensus is that opening up the convention would create lots of difficulties, is more likely to result in a watering down of protections given to refugees, and that at this point in time, there's no political appetite or to open up the convention and possibly then include tens of millions of people within the convention's this particular status. So I'm not a fan of proposals that we open up the refugee convention to include climate persons. But then, of course, the question becomes, well, how do we think of what climate migrants need, and how do we think about what protections they need? So we'll come back to that. I wanted to share with you some comments about migration, just because as lawyers, sometimes we can have discussions amongst ourselves that are just responding to the legal literature, but there is a huge field literature and empirical literature by anthropologists, sociologists, demographers, population epidemiologists who study the issue of migration. And I wanted to share with you a little bit of some of the important concepts there, because I think it has relevance for how we as attorneys can think about what legal statuses ought we to consider, what kind of legal solutions should we consider. So when we think of migration, an important model is to think about what we call push-pull factors. What pushes people out of regions? What pushes people to move versus what actually draws them in? And a really critical thing is that people can be exposed to a threatening circumstance, but not all families and individuals are going to make the same decision. So you can see this. Think about a weather event or an event happening here in North America. The governor of New York will say, we're about to have the hurricane of the century, please move to higher ground. People don't always move, and people don't move for a number of different reasons. And the same is true even at the international level. So people can be exposed to the same climate event, so a hurricane, a typhoon, a cyclone, but individuals and families do not always make the same decisions to leave. I think it's a little bit different when the drivers are political conflict or sort of genocidal humanitarian violence. Those are certainly drivers. Other things that are drivers, so as I said, it could be the environment, it could be a political conflict, could be networks. Everyone in their village has already moved on. They're sending remittances back. People follow social networks. There can be gender differences. Women are less likely to move until things become very bad. Young men are more likely to move first, right, as they try to get income in the cities or they try to diversify their sources of income. What's interesting is that we also don't have a ton of information about different types of environmental catastrophes. So we do have a sense of what happens after floods. Those tend to drive short-term migrations, or hurricanes, because you have such devastation, you do see short and long-term migration. We have less data for things like, say, wildfires, which will be a growing issue in the United States. So we don't have always a lot of data on different types of environmental exposures. But I think here, the key thing for this photo from this slide is to take away the idea that just because there's been a catastrophic weather event or a climate event does not necessarily mean that people will automatically move. The other important idea I want you to think about is what we call trapped populations. Remember, the people who are able to move are often the most able-bodied, have the capital to move, have the resources to move, have the social skills and confidence to move, or have no choice but to move. But there's often always a population that's left. We call those trapped populations. And those are the most vulnerable people who are elderly, people who are very sick, or people who are exceptionally very poor and can't even make the journey. One phenomenon I just wanted to draw your attention to is that climate migration does seem to be driving urbanization. So there's no country or region in the world where you don't see the really significant growth in cities and what are sometimes referred to as informal habitations or settlements around like the formal parts of cities as people move from rural areas to urban areas in the hopes of participating in the labor force, finding another source of income, sending remittances home. And so a lot of the migration literature is really focused on what do we do to help cities deal with the influx of people who are not able to be in their home regions because the conditions have changed, there's water scarcity, there's drought, the heat is unbearable, whatever it is that might be. So urbanization is actually well-documented and well-known migration pathway due to climate. And, you know, it's very interesting as I've sort of just even noticing the popular press on it, a lot of that has changed, you know, recognizing that climate migration is going to be an issue. Even here in North America, it's sort of led to some interesting sort of public discourses about maybe this will lead to the great renaissance of the American Midwest. You know, the great American coastal cities, we've seen people leave even with COVID, and people are beginning to look at other cities in the center and the north of the United States, for example. So while on the one hand, we talk about this urbanization, I think COVID has made me wonder, are we going to see some changes in it if people are going to move to cities, but maybe they're going to move away from coastal cities. So all this is to be seen. And I just draw your attention to urbanization is just a very important phenomenon, or changes in urbanization practice will be an important phenomenon to think about. The other thing I wanted to particularly draw your attention to is the idea that is the challenge of small island developing states. So we know that sea level rise, which is associated with warmer temperatures, is going to pose a direct challenge to a lot of low-lying island nations, some of whom are very barely above sea level. And the threat to these island nations is going to be from singular catastrophic events like severe weather events, a cyclone, a hurricane, which will cause devastation. But it's also going to come from the inevitable and slower erosion of the waters. Drinking water is going to be salinated. You're going to see the destruction of the shoreline. You're going to see the destruction of sort of fishing industries. So we call events like these kind of a slow onset climate event that we know is going to lead to populations having to think about moving first to higher ground and then moving elsewhere. And if any of you are interested, I encourage you to sort of Google Anote Tong, who is a very charismatic and powerful former head of Kiribati, who sort of led the small island nation kind of lobby group and advocacy group to think specifically about their risk. So there's a number of documentaries on this. And you can just get a sense more of what it means to be in a place that is slowly getting submerged. And there's some very interesting legal questions here, if any of you are international lawyers in the making, which is what happens to an island state if its territory disappears? What rights do dead states have? What rights do populations have when they're no longer attached to a particular territory? How do we think about planned relocations for entire island states? Now, Anote Tong, as I said, the former head of Kiribati, has spoken about the concept of migration with dignity. He has sort of has embraced as one response the idea that we know that communities are going to have to move. Let's plan for these relocations and do it in a way that is foresightful, rather than having to do things in a hurry and sort of asking for the charity of countries to let us in. But then you can see that raises other questions about, well, where do they go and who gives them the land and whose obligation it is to give land? And is there a climate justice issue here about individuals from small island states or other communities that are slowly being eroded or destroyed ought to be able to move to high emitting carbon states, right? What obligations significantly contributing to climate change have to small island states like this, which are getting destroyed because of climate change? Does anyone recognize this picture? They've all been. I'll give you a clue. It's in the United States and often referred to as the first significant climate displacement event in North America. It surely wasn't the first climate displacement event that's off the newspaper headlines. So this is a picture of New Orleans circa 2005, which led to over 1 million people moving leaving New Orleans because of the flooding. And I should note that there were two events which happened here, sort of man-made disasters, so the levees didn't hold, but also the storm surge and the amount of rainfall overwhelmed the infrastructure. And this led to a really significant 40% of people living in New Orleans had to move. So it's the single biggest displacement event due to a climate event in North America. And it gives, many people saw this as a harbinger of what's to come if we do not think about our infrastructure and think ahead. Anybody recognize any of these photos? These are very American. I'll give this clue. They're slightly American centered because it sort of reflects me living here on the East Coast. But this is the pictures of some of the photos of people leaving. Yes, so this was people leaving post Hurricane Sandy. Yep, the Jersey Shore, and you can get a sense of the devastation. And the photo below, I'm going to just thank you to whoever got that one. And people recognize this. People are pondering. So these are photos of the devastation of Hurricane Irene in Puerto Rico. And again, the exodus from Hurricane Irene was really significant, 500,000 to 600,000 people moving within the United States, and you can sort of see where they landed up. So I think these events have particularly focused the mind on the importance of thinking about migration. And also with some lessons learned. And I'm going to come back to what happened in New Jersey and thinking about buyouts in Staten Island and Jersey. Anyone recognize either of these photos? So I put these up there to say that although people may be less aware, there are already planned relocations taking place. So the photo at the top is in Louisiana, so that, moving, right? So this is Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana is an example of a planned relocation taking place. And the photo in the bottom is Newtok, Alaska, which has also begun to plan for relocation. So things are happening closer to home, though they don't get the attention that you might think. And there's lots of discussion as what will happen to Miami and New York, New Orleans again. And I haven't got a sense that there's as much discussion about the big Canadian cities because they tend to be inland, but there will be questions about warming and where people will want to live. So just a couple of things with the legal considerations. Let me keep an idea on the time here. So as I've said before a few times, there are no formal legally binding international legal instruments which define or codify the concept of climate refugees or climate migration. So there's no equivalent of the Convention on Refugees with regard to climate refugees. This is not to say that it hasn't been in the international governance structures or processes and that there aren't some international mechanisms for beginning to think about these issues. So in Cancun in 2010, so the UNFCCC, it was the COP16, it was the first time that displacement associated with climate change came out of the documents from COP16. And those documents stressed that parties must address adaptation and invited parties to think about measures that they could, with regard to climate change, induced displacement, migration, and planned relocation. In 2015, you saw the development of the Sendai framework, which is a voluntary non-binding document that recognizes that states have a primary responsibility to reduce disaster risk, but it also will have to be a multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder event. At COP21, the parties created a task force to think about recommendations to avert displacement relating to the adverse impacts of climate change. Some of you may have heard in 2018, in 2018, the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly and Regular Migration was adopted by the UN General Assembly. And again, one of the main objectives of the Global Compact was to sort of minimize the drivers and structural factors that compel people to leave their country. So again, thinking about their model, what can countries do to sort of slow down people leaving, to support people staying in place, to allow people to adapt in place? I think, I'm happy to sort of answer specific questions about any of these. I don't want to have a bunch of slides with a lot of text and quotes in them, although that's a very legal sort of PowerPoint to do. I think what's maybe the critical take-home point here is that negotiating around what rights, obligations, and climate migrants may have has been a very thorny issue. And you can imagine that it's so partly because of the sheer numbers of people involved, the complexity of who might be a climate migrant, the fact that climate migration decisions are often very multifactorial and complex. And you can imagine that a lot of the discussions that are being and arguments are around forms of restitution and climate financing, very tricky. I don't particularly anticipate that we'll make huge headways in the current COP, but I think I was sort of encouraged to have you guys think about, and we'll do this in the discussion, is what sort of protections would you think about? What sorts of things might be fair? How do we think about the legal protection gap? Because it's when you cross a border, after all, that we find the legal protection gap. But as we know, most climate migration is going to happen internally. So how do states plan for and think about protecting the rights and needs of climate migrants? So just a couple of ideas on the table. The other point I want to make is that even though the main critique is there's no single international convention which protects the rights of climate migrants, there is soft law that recognizes that climate migration is an issue and recognizes that states must consider environmental disaster and climate change factors as they think about both migrants into their states and migrants within their states. So I'm going to toggle a little bit. And I want to sort of think about mental health. And I hope it doesn't feel too far afield. But as somebody who's worked with refugees and migrants, I'm frequently asked the question about how do we build infrastructures? How do we meet the needs for people who are being displaced? And also, I will add, I'm frequently asked when I'm giving these presentations to think about things like eco-distress and people's own, even non-displaced person's sense of anxiety about how to deal with climate change. So I thought I would take a moment to think about that. So it can be really difficult to untangle the source of distress from what happens when people migrate. So when people migrate, there's actually layers of trauma that occurs to them. So there's whatever they were exposed to before they moved. There's whatever that happens to them on the journey to get to wherever they choose to go. As you can imagine, the journey of climate migrants, as well as other migrants, can be really fraught. They can be exposed to a lot of violence. There can be a lot of sexual trafficking. It can heighten whatever mental health challenges you might have had beforehand. You might develop new mental health challenges along the way. Lack of housing is by far the most significant contributor to stress and mood disorders. We know that there are very high rates of anxiety and mood disorders amongst migrants and amongst climate migrants, very high rates of trauma, especially because of the exposure to violence that occurs to people on the way. You do not need to be a psychiatrist to know that when you have climate displacement in the context of political instability or a conflict or war, that the levels of trauma that people can be exposed to are even higher. But I would actually wanted to make sure that I noted that when people are migrating, often what they lead with is not, and when they present for mental health or present for healthcare, they're not leading very often with the mental health piece. What they're often first concerned about and presenting with is chronic illnesses. So whatever asthma, diabetes, heart disease, maybe it's more complicated, seizure disorders. These are things that tend to get neglected and ignored along the trauma route. Very often migrants, whether they're climate migrants or not, don't have access to health services. They're not eligible for health services. They can't walk into a clinic. They're concerned that any contact with a clinic would somehow bring them to the attention of authorities. And so they choose to defer medical treatment or mental health treatment until it's really absolutely emergent. And so I'm involved with a study now where we're speaking to people who chose to move from Puerto Rico after Hurricane Irene. And what I hear sort of again and again is that often people will not even pay attention to their medical and mental health issues because their primary interest is really about getting stable, finding housing. But often, as you saw from the pictures of those urban settlements that I showed earlier, the places where people are living or forced to make their house can be very unhealthy, unsafe, no running water, crowded, cramped spaces. And we've learned a lot from COVID about the implications of that for public health. There's no doubt that climate migrants are going to change patterns of infectious diseases. So I always hesitate to say that because I don't want people to see climate migrants as vectors or carriers of dangerous diseases. But they could have been exposed to something at home and then they don't get treatment and they can bring it with them. But also the exposure to infectious disease works the other way around. So individuals may have had no exposure to an infectious illness. They get to a new place and now that's where they have their exposure. And without running water, without living in cramped conditions, they may have no ability to sort of protect themselves. As a psychiatrist, I hear a lot about the degrees to which migrants in general, and including climate migrants, are exposed to violence. So the more people can be at risk for traffickers, for state agents, from non-state actors. There can be a lot of interpersonal increase in interpersonal violence within communities and within families because of the stress of the circumstances. We often see increased rates of alcohol and drug use amongst people who are in these circumstances, and that always increases interpersonal violence. So just wanted to put all of these issues on the table. I think what's really critical is that we might make an assumption that people moving collectively, so if an entire village has to move, that can be protective, but not necessarily, right? So moving as a group may not actually protect people's mental health for a number of reasons. People may just value having income over moving with their family. So I think thinking about the impacts are very are complex, and I'll answer any questions that you have on them. I think I have a colleague named Kate Burrows who's done some very interesting work on persons in Indonesia who've been displaced because of earthquakes. And I think her recent research has reminded me, of course, that people's notion of what mental health is going to vary hugely by context. So an Indonesian earthquake displaced survivors' notion of what contributes to their well-being is going to be quite different, perhaps, from what a Connecticut homeowner whose house has been flooded because of the latest hurricane is going to feel. So mental health is a very culturally complex construct. But I think we've also learned some lessons from COVID, right? You may have seen photos like these, that we're not well equipped to deal with large groups of people moving en masse. We don't have the physical infrastructure, we don't have the transportation infrastructure, and the health system was overloaded. So I think that does not bode well unless we engage in very different planning as we think about what are we going to do if we're truly anticipating larger groups of people to come in response to climate events. So I think there's just some lessons learned. I wanted to just include this slide, even though it's not specifically about climate migration, because I'm often asked by persons about, how are psychiatrists and how's the mental health profession thinking about eco-distress and the impact of environmental or climate change on mental health. And I'll hasten to say that there are new syndromes that are being sort of coined. You may have seen headlines around eco-distress or eco-anxiety, particularly in young people who are worried that they're going to have a foreshortened future because the world is not going to look the same. Not a mental health condition, not a mental health disorder, but certainly a phenomenon that parents and teachers and psychologists are reporting, which is that persons around the world are getting very anxious about what the future will hold. There are also more specific terms like solastalgia. So think of nostalgia, but solastalgia, which is how do we begin to conceptualize what people who are forced to move or relocate because their homes won't look the same are feeling? And I think that's a really interesting concept, because let me just say that until you've been forced to move or until you've made a journey, people often don't recognize how much their personal identity is very bound up in where they are and who their community is. There's a really big literature that already exists about immigration and thinking about the ways in which the impact psychologically that immigration has on people. And it's really clear that whether people can see it as just a set of losses or see it also as a potential set of opportunities, particularly for their children to build a new and more hopeful future, depends hugely on the circumstances by which they left. So if people are leaving without choice, if people are leaving on short notice, if people are leaving because of circumstances like violence or catastrophe, they're going to experience the changes, the changes to their identity, perhaps in a more threatening and grieving way, as somebody who brings more agency into the decision to leave. And I'm sure all of you have made moves in your past. Some of you have made, moved for school or for work, or have had families you've done. I think that the migration journey is always ultimately a very individual one. So that's something that I think about, because how do we help people work through this process, and how do we help communities work through this process if it's going to be happening on a large scale? I have no clear answers on this yet, but just identifying some of the challenges that I foresee. So next steps. I think there's so many potential responses: legal, infrastructure, housing, social services. I think I just wanted to throw some ideas at you and hear your take on it as well, which is, I think the single biggest danger that we have is treating these events as catastrophic and unpredictable. We actually have a lot of information, maybe not about specific where and when and how specific communities or persons might move, or what the trigger for moving is, but we actually have a pretty good sense of where the high-risk populations are. And I say this because we also know that people move and tend to move along social networks, and how and where they move is also determined by border policies and restrictions. So I think there is, even with deeply imperfect knowledge, an ability to predict what vulnerable populations are. And I think that in the end, we're going to find regional solutions rather than a single international convention or a defining definition. I think that we're going to be recognizing that climate migration, unlike, say, people fleeing political persecution, although obviously there can be an overlap, often climate migration and environmental migration is temporary, unless you've had a permanent loss of, say, your island state. So maybe we need to think about legal statuses that are more fluid. Maybe we need to think about things like temporary protected legal statuses. Maybe what we need to be thinking about are tools like free movement agreements, which is recognizing that people stay regional, and what they're really looking to do is diversify income through the dry spell, or diversify income while the villages get rebuilt. So I think that the legal solutions are ultimately going to have to be very creative. Thinking about labor mobility schemes. Maybe we want to be thinking about, rather than creating new international conventions from scratch, adapting existing guidelines, for example, guidelines for protection in the disaster context to climate. And I think above all, I think we need to be thinking about pathways for for migrants and flows. So rather than creating a circumstances where borders are rigid, and I understand why governments will want to regulate borders, but when we create barriers, literally with border walls, there will flow in desperation in any number of unpredicted, uncounted ways. Would we be better off thinking about more permissible migrant flows and pathways rather than erecting firm barriers? Really, when we're thinking about what migrants and climate migrants need, really what individuals are looking for is social protections, the right to housing, the right to access healthcare, the right for their kids to go to school. Can we think about bolstering their social protections without linking social protections to their nationality? Can we think about creative existing humanitarian law or human rights law that would allow us to recognize what their core needs are without having to create an entire new legal category, since that seems, I think, very unlikely in this current period? I think there's a very interesting legal literature that tries to reimagine even more broadly the framework through which we look through climate migrants. So you can look at the climate justice literature to be thinking about what are our ethical and normative obligations to people. And there is a very interesting climate mobility literature, which is rather than thinking of persons who must stay within borders, can we reimagine the right to be mobile? There's certainly a sort of an anti-colonialist literature that really calls for rethinking the fact that we often divide migrants up into good versus bad migrants, acceptable versus non-acceptable forms of migrants. So refugees who flee political persecution, an acceptable form of migrant. Individuals who try to desperately improve their economic condition, a less acceptable form of migrant, and so on. So perhaps what we need to be having is our discussions about how current international legal regimes perpetuate these distinctions, even inadvertently, between who is a worthy migrant and who is not. As I said, there's an entire literature, not legal, which really thinks about what are the social protections that are needed, what sorts of economic supports can be provided. I actually think that climate migration also forces us to think very creatively about infrastructure. I work closely with a colleague in our Department of Architecture who has done a lot of work around housing. It's not just housing for migrants that is the challenge. It's the housing for growing populations within countries, within urban areas. Can we be creative about how we think about meeting their housing needs in particular, so that they are sustainable, so that they can provide food and water? Because I have to acknowledge that sort of when countries think about large numbers of people coming in, when communities think about large numbers of people coming in, even if it's from the state next door, right? So Connecticut, where I live, has had a relatively large influx of people moving out of New York because of COVID. And that's put stress on roads and schools and housing. And so these are opportunities for us to think about how can we build more sustainably? How can we build so that we don't have to think about taxing the grid? I think that some of the most important responses to climate migration are actually going to be non-legal. And I think it's challenging for us as communities to rethink how we live. But I ultimately think that is where many of the solutions to climate migration are going to be coming from. And I bring that up because, of course, the journal is an interdisciplinary journal. And I'm assuming that all of you who are listening are interdisciplinary by inclination. And I would encourage you to think about partnering with people outside of the law to think about solutions. So I will pause there and say, I think even with non-climate migration, just with regular migration policy, there's an interesting question about when a migrant stops thinking themselves as the other, and when we stop thinking about migrant as the other, and when and how we start thinking of people as being part of our community. And so I leave you with the question of how do we get from us and them to a we, which, given the size of our planet and the fragility of our planet, is ultimately how we have to think about our populations. I'll leave you there and invite comments, feedback. I'll take my slides down so you can see my face. I put a lot of ideas on the table where you want it to go, and I'm happy to go to discuss whatever is on your mind.
Thank you so much, Professor Prabhu. And if anybody has questions, feel free to either like put it in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom if you want to say it face to face. Amazing presentation. I could start with the first question if that sounds good.
Sure.
So I see there's so many different aspects to consider for climate migration. It's really enlightened me to how like it's not just a legal issue, it's not just a psychological issue, it's not just a health issue, it's just so interdisciplinary. So I was wondering, like, with our short time frame, is there a certain aspect that in our professions we could focus on and advocate for as like more important to fix than the others? Meaning, like, I don't know, do we focus on access to housing since it seems so important and like really narrow that down, let's say for like a time crunch where we can't get it all, or is it just all equal? Or yeah.
All right, so I will answer that question both from your students and you're thinking about what you want to do with your, with your futures and how you want to put your advocacy efforts, as well as thinking about this problem, which is, I think it's really important as lawyers that we don't just speak to other lawyers, that, just as this discussion around climate migration can become one of international lawyers discussing how we meet the protection needs of climate migrants with other international lawyers and discussing prior legal scholarship. That's all very important because that informs negotiations at the COP, it informs international law, it informs, the outcomes of human rights tribunals. But where I have personally found some of the most interesting work is working as a lawyer with people outside of my field. So I'll bring up the example of housing is going to be a really big issue. There's plenty of legal issues that come up around housing. Anna, my colleague, could speak at length about the challenges of zoning rules and local rules and regional inquiries and communities that feel displaced by new housing coming in. So for every piece of the puzzle, right, for every aspect of the puzzle, there's always a legal issue that requires amplification and never enough legal expertise being focused on it. So I imagine that all of you have a bunch of different interests. And actually, I would love for you guys to chat and tell me what your particular interests are. You can take your particular interest, focus it on the problem, in this case, climate migration, and bring a unique legal expertise to it. My point is that often climate migration is only focused, seems like the literature is only about international law, but a lot of this work is going to be done at the local and regional levels and in any other domain. So let's talk about health system preparedness. Let's talk about what it means to build sustainable and climate resilient hospitals. What does it mean to build climate resilient schools? What does it mean to build climate resilient infrastructure and housing or transportation? So pick the piece that animates you and bring your legal creativity to it.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
I think I saw, there's one hand gone. Grace, was it Grace? Okay. Laura, you decide whether you want to go with Grace's hand, or I see Jason's got a question in the chat.
Sure thing. I think I don't see Grace on my screen. So in that case, maybe we start with Jason, whose question is in the chat there, and I can read that out loud. So how might the security discourse around migration impact political willingness to provide adequate legal responses or mental health resources to climate migrants? How could we move the discourse beyond security?
Great question, and you're absolutely right. I think in a way, when climate migration has gotten a lot of attention too, because it's commonly referred to as what we call a conflict amplifier, so that the movement of persons because of climate events and the scarcity of resources that climate changes will bring about will, in theory, amplify sort of resource conflicts, resource wars, worsen humanitarian situations. I think recognizing and educating communities that a lot of environmental migration is internal, right? So it's going to be people moving from New York City to rural Connecticut, from Miami to Austin, or whatever the trajectory, the movements are going to be. In that case, we're not talking so much about civil and international conflicts or destabilizing political regimes. It's about how local and communities are going to respond to large numbers of people, or certain numbers of people larger than what they're used to. So I think the security, implicit with the security framework is the othering, right? It's people coming in with different values, different demands, different cultural understandings, who are going to undermine our way of life. I think that's the implicit piece of the security conflict. And recognizing that much of climate migration, as I said, is going to be happening internally, or it might be short term, or it might be about, say, income diversification, can take the edge off of that. Now, there's no doubt that I think in certain regions, water scarcity, decreased agricultural productivity, large, numbers of people living in irregular housing around cities are going to create civil unrest, if only because, communities that have large numbers of new people coming in are often very hostile to them. And so I'm not going to deny that, and there is a literature on the correlation between conflict and climate change. But I think how you reframe it is recognizing it's also about us. It's about people moving from, Lethbridge to someplace else because it's now too dry and too hot. So, Jason, feel free to ask a follow-up or tell me if that's not clear enough, or to challenge any of that in the chat. All right, should we read Grace's?
That sounds great. And then after Grace, then we have Julia in line as well.
You want to read it out loud in case people are just listening in?
Oh, yes, for sure. I didn't realize Grace was in the chat. Awesome. So Grace's question is, Professor Prabhu, thank you very much for the elucidating and insightful presentation. As a daughter of immigrants and somebody who has difficulty processing climate grief lately, very relatable, I really appreciate your knowledge and the legal solutions you have introduced. Yesterday, I read the news that 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. And there's a really cool link there. It opens up a very good PDF that I just clicked. I had not thought of climate migration from a gendered perspective previously. I was wondering if you could speak more to this issue. What solutions and programs are being put in place to address this problem, and how can we learn more?
Big question, really interesting. Wish I also knew more about the gendered piece of it, but I'm going to actually answer the second piece of the question first, which is how do we think about solutions? I think one of the things that I've tried to convey is that the context in which climate migration happens really happens at such a local level, right? So the reasons why an individual in Southeast Asia might move after a hurricane or think about the choices there are going to be different than an individual living in sub-Saharan Africa who's moving to the city to diversify income because they can't sustain crops and they can't sustain livestock anymore. So also the gender context and the cultural context in which those migrants move are going to be very different, right? So the experience of a woman in a village in India is going to be different from the experience of a woman elsewhere. So I think recognizing that there are going to be gendered impacts is very important, and recognizing that women are going to make, I think, the migration decision to leave at different points than, say, young men who might position themselves as laborers moving to send home remittances to the family. We know already from literature that, for example, earlier marriage is often a family's response, an adaptation response. So limit the number of people in the household by marrying, girls off earlier rather than later can be a response, but that might be in some contexts more than others. So I don't know about that. I'm going to have to read that report. About 80% of the people displaced by climate change are women. And I'm not, that number strikes me as a little bit high, because displaced by climate change Are we talking about a hurricane, a singular weather event? Are we talking about a slow onset event? I could believe that individuals who are trapped and unable to move, there might be significant gender differential there. Partly because perhaps the roles and employment opportunities for women may be very different. Women may be expected to stay home and take care of, say, elderly or ill people who can't move. So who's going to take care of no choice but to stay behind? Or obviously women as primary caretakers of children who are also too young to move. So I can imagine actually that women are large percentages of the trapped populations, but again, it's going to depend hugely on the context. But maybe my takeaway point is the same as yours, which is recognizing that even as we're talking about displaced populations, there are going to be significant differences, not just on socioeconomic status, education, but gender as well, is very important.
Thank you so much for that. And next, Juliet, feel free to unmute with your question.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I have not had that much time or chances to like engage with the intersection between psychiatry and law, etc. I did have a bit of a chance in undergrad to kind of see an intersection with philosophy. So it's really interesting just to see how it applies in like different fields. My question was, you touched on it a bit, but I know that like mental health and mental disorders, there's sometimes like a conception that they're culture bound, quote unquote, and that they don't necessarily, they're more prevalent in other cultures. And it might be the case that when climate migrants are in a situation where trauma, anxiety, other mental health issues might come about, they might not have had, there might be like less of an awareness of these issues because, like you said, they might be focused on things like resource management, making sure that they have all the basic necessities that they need. And in this regard, without this like access to education about this, I was just wondering how do you think if there's a way to bridge this gap for climate migrants in regards to education and help just when they're in situations where they have migrated or gone to new places and might be facing with these issues that they might not have had access to like knowledge about surrounding these issues.
Yeah, so let me break. So I think there's a lot to be said into that. Let me just unpack it a little bit in the following way. So I think it's worth noting that most of the research on the mental health impacts of displacements or climate change or climate migration is actually done in developing countries rather than in more international sort of settings. So for example, lots and lots of research on just people who are displaced by Hurricane Katrina, a growing pool, and say people who've left Puerto Rico. And that's important. And I think there's probably some important takeaways even from that. For example, the importance of housing stability, that housing stability predicts mental health outcomes and predicts positive mental health outcomes more than, say, access to mental health care. Having said that, we know that the experience of what well-being is, what distress is very culturally specific. And that has to do perhaps with how people may see their sense of well-being is related to what's going on in their family or their land or their physical space. And we don't have a ton of research on that question. So you've kind of identified actually a growing research question. We do have data on sort of the snapshot, on certain types of mental health syndromes that emerge after catastrophes, after, hurricanes, floods. We know that people have higher rates of, particularly people who've been displaced, have higher rates of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, variations of post-traumatic stress disorders. And how are we responsive? How should we be responsive to that? Is always really complicated for me because it's coupled to the infrastructure question, which is are we only going to be able to provide sort of crash humanitarian support and humanitarian first aid, which is short term, and it can be critically helpful, but not long term, because these individuals are not going to be able to access the healthcare system. So I think your question raises the importance of developing infrastructures that provide access to and give access to healthcare and mental health care to people that delink it from their nationality status. So you can access a mental health system or a clinic if you're a resident or a national of a country. That's obviously going to limit what sorts of treatments you're going to have. I will say that coming out of COVID, there was a lot of hope that telehealth and digital health could be the way to providing healthcare or mental health care for people who are in difficult circumstances. And I think there's a role for that. But remember, there's also a digital divide. If you're fleeing your home in the middle of the night, you probably don't have access to a laptop or a computer or a phone that has, the kind of capacities to do telehealth. So even with something like telehealth or digital tools of support, there are limitations. Often women in the households aren't the ones who are the holders of the cell phones, the one cell phone in the family. So I think your question has raised the point about what interventions are appropriate are going to depend on the context, the cultural context. There are real infrastructure, and language barriers to accessing mental health care. We need to do more research on specific populations, and we need to ask people who are displaced what would be the most helpful to their well-being. It may not be access to a psychiatrist and an antidepressant. In fact, I'm pretty sure that that's not going to be the answer that most people are going to give. What they're probably going to point to in terms of what's helpful for their well-being is stable housing, stable income, not living in fear of violence, and maybe access to educational and employment opportunities. So that was a long answer, but to a long question. So I hope that gives you something to work with.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
And next up we have Carla.
Hi, thank you again so much for your presentation. It was pretty comprehensive over many disciplinary fields, so it was interesting to see the interconnection of like health, law, even policy making. Really interesting talk. The one thing that really stuck out for me was brought up at the beginning. It was the distinction you made between the labels of migrant and refugee, and the hesitancies you had in subsuming climate migrants under the refugee umbrella. And I definitely see why, because refugee is definitely a strictly defined term that seems more political in its causes for why people would move. But I also feel hesitant to not recognize some climate migrants as refugees, just because some political decisions can instigate severe climate consequences. And I'm thinking of presidents like Bolsonaro, who have very reckless policy-making decisions that could have severe impacts on his people. And I would almost describe that as like violence or even persecution of the Brazilian population. Do you think there would be value in having a separate climate refugee label for people who are fleeing countries where presidents are almost negligent in their policy decisions surrounding climate?
So let me begin by saying I have a colleague, Sumudu Atapatu, University of Wisconsin, but also works with the Center of International Sustainable Development Law, which, as you know, is close links to the journal, who has written about this issue at length, which is one, noting that labels are political and often overly political, that they don't sufficiently consider the ethical and humanitarian and human rights obligations that we owe individuals. And two, you're not wrong that my answer was a little bit more framed in terms of what I think is the feasibility and the politics of actually being able to reopen a convention and incorporate climate into that. One, I do think that countries would be very reluctant to reopen that definition. And two, I do think there'd be concern, and there's genuine concern that the current protections to refugees under the convention would be diluted, which would be deeply worrying at a time when we're only seeing increasing number of conventional political refugees. You're not wrong. And let me also note something else, which is being a climate migrant does not mean that you can't also be a political refugee. That often people are making climate migration journeys in the context of complex humanitarian disasters. So people may, in fact, have multiple labels. And just because they may be climate migrants shouldn't preclude them from also being able to seek asylum or seek political refugee status. And in fact, I've heard immigration judges sort of speak about when people present their cases for asylum, and that issues around, they will often hear pieces of the story around what's happening in terms of weather, environment, resource loss, resource degradation. So it's not like even when people are making political claims that the environmental context hasn't already made their way into the stories that they're presenting for consideration. So let me say that. I think that's an interesting idea, which is how do we hold individuals or governments responsible or accountable for the ways in which they're contributing to environmental degradation and climate change? I think I don't have a good answer on this, except to note that I think this is what the climate justice sort of arguments and activists, I don't mean activists in a pejorative way, I mean advocates are the case that they're making, which is climate change isn't just happening out of the blue. It's happening because of the deliberate choices made by industries and governments to fail to meet what would be sort of maybe sensible, what some people would consider to be sensible, and the minimal requirements to avoid significant environmental and climate damage. And so I think the idea is sort of encompassed by climate justice advocates who would make the argument that high emission states have an ethical obligation to protect and to provide protections to individuals who are harmed by that. So I think those are the kinds of arguments that are being used to try to lobby for resources, for climate financing, for adaptation financing. It's been a difficult practical sell, just because of the scale of the numbers involved, of the people involved, and the amount of money that it would take. We've seen some countries make steps. New Zealand at one point offered and considered climate visas. I think that scheme has been at this point quietly retired. But I think that's sort of an active and important political question, which is, does Canada, does the US, does China as a higher emitter country, should they be required to offer a certain number of climate refugees? Should they be required to offer visas? Should they be required to offer space so that communities could relocate? I think there's an argument to be made for that. I mean, people are making that argument.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
I think we should ask. Oops, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just think I was a bit naive to think that all the activism could be placed in the labeling of migrant and refugeeism. So it's interesting to see there are other avenues for climate justice advocacy than just how you label migrants.
You're not wrong that the labeling has consequences and creates obligations. There are legal scholars who have argued that climate migrants should be called climate displaced persons because it underscores the fact that their movement was forced, right? As opposed to the term climate migrant, which might imply more agency and more choice than in fact might be the case for the person. So you're not wrong that different terms invoke different types of obligations. Maybe the question back to you, and not trying to put the obligation to solve this, but given what I've tried to present about the complexity of how environmental migration takes place, even climate migration, given that we know that the choices to move are multifactorial, then how do we land on terms like displaced or migrant? How do we decide? It's easiest when there's a single catastrophic climate event, a hurricane, a typhoon, a massive flood, and the levees broke. What do we do in other types of slow onset events like droughtification? I didn't particularly talk. I don't know. I don't have good answers yet. What do other people think? Or what are people's thoughts? I realize for many of you, this is an entirely new topic area. And so there's no way to, as I said, master that information. But what thoughts are you left with? What jumps out at you? Should Canada offer up 5, 10, 100, 1,000 unlimited climate refugees for persons coming from low-lying Pacific Island states that are slowly being submerged? Is that a way for Canada to fulfill its climate obligations?
I think, yeah, like, I think there definitely has to be some type of, if possible, like pre-planning to like how many to make it to just like anticipate the issue coming in. Because I can imagine, I don't know, some crisis strikes that's very significant. We don't have the infrastructure to support everyone. Nobody knows who's doing what. And it becomes like a COVID situation where something hits, nobody has anything planned, no agreements have been placed. And while all this bureaucratic back and forth is occurring, people are suffering from violence and of, psychological distress. So yeah, I just think whatever we do, like, please, let's plan something in advance, in time. And yeah, Sophia, I see, has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It's so interesting. Is my mic garbled? I've heard that it's a bit hard to hear me these days. Okay, good. Well, I just wanted to say thank you for bringing like this sort of human dimension to the law and the interdisciplinary nature as well. In response to your question, I was kind of thinking some of my own questions, which is how do you decide who gets to kind of come in? Like, who are those? If there are a certain number of people, on what basis are they chosen? And can that decision be made in advance? And how do you decide how many? I guess that would be based on Canada's capacity rather than on the actual needs of those people. But just thinking about that human dimension, I guess I'm trying to kind of understand, like, when it comes to climate justice, how do we make sure that no one is left behind? Maybe that's a naive goal because it seems almost inevitable that some people will be left behind. But when people are making these migrant pathways, it's like, is there space for everyone to go somewhere?
That's a beautiful question. Is there space for everyone to go? And will they want to go? I didn't create a slide on this, but so let me just tell you a very sort of domestic example. So after Hurricane Sandy, a number of coastal front homes in New York and Staten Island, a lot of communities were utterly destroyed. And one of the federal responses was to offer buyouts to individuals to move from their communities elsewhere. And what's interesting was that certainly not everybody wanted to take the buyouts. There are certainly individuals who felt like at their point in life or given their connection to their home and their community, they wanted to stay. What's also interesting is that there turned out to be interesting racial and socioeconomic disparities in who chose to take the buyout offers. And a study, and I've now forgotten the year, there was a US federal study which looked at buyouts across the country for coastal communities and weather damaged communities. Again, found really different responses to who was able to take the buyouts, who felt the buyouts met their needs along racial and socioeconomic lines. in other words, what I'm trying to say is, another example, after Hurricane Katrina destroyed much of downtown, much of New Orleans, at an early stage, a number of development architects and urban planners sort of developed an idea that would then, recognizing that these were some of those urban communities were going to be at risk and continue to be at risk. We could fully anticipate that they would continue to be at risk for flooding. Proposed creating massive green spaces. So rather than rebuilding those downtown New Orleans communities and neighborhoods, they would create green spaces. And as it turns out, when those plans were shown to a larger audience, the communities neighborhoods that were proposed to be made green and to turn into parks were predominantly a minority and Black communities. And they were experienced, so the plans were experienced not as thoughtful planning for the future or an anticipation of inevitable flooding, but another way in which, say, Black community members lost their neighborhoods. So there are all sorts of these unexpected, unanticipated outcomes of our interventions that have really different racial, gendered, and socioeconomic impacts that we can't always predict, or maybe in retrospect it's clear. All of which to say, it's very hard to think about what the right interventions are without multi-stakeholder intervention and community intervention, and without really active thinking about the impacts on groups that have been made marginal or vulnerable, so along different lines. So sure, planned relocation is one potential response. Planned migration responses and migration flows, also potential intervention. The challenge is always in the details. There's going to be no single best answer for every situation. Some of you have told us where you come from there. Sort of earlier on the chat, as I said, there's Winnipeg, Burlington, Waterford. How would you feel if a big section of your urban downtown or a suburban area was designated as a potential resettlement zone for a community, a coastal community that was being flooded, an island country community that was being submerged? What do you think the response of the local community might be? How would you meet their infrastructure needs? How would you create transportation? How would you think about the schools? How would you worry about employment prospects? I'm not saying this as a way of getting you to say it's a good idea or a bad idea. Just recognizing the integration of communities is something that can be very challenging.
Definitely. Thank you so much for all your insight. It's been incredible. We have time for one more question. I noticed that Emma had a hand up earlier. I'm not sure if you still have your thoughts to say.
I didn't really have a fully formed thought. It was kind of just a reaction to kind of the question that you left us in. And a few times we brought up kind of like the ethical obligations of countries. And when we talk about migration and about climate change, a lot of the times it's less up to governments to do the right things. And I think that kind of after 3 years in law school, I'm very cynical in looking at that and in looking at, like, do we trust the Canadian government to do the right thing and issue climate refugee passports? Or do we think that there needs to be binding legal obligations at either the international or regional level to kind of compel governments to kind of do what's right and to take action to kind of rectify these issues? And also, do we think that those international legal obligations are going to be realistic in the face of rising xenophobia across a lot of Western countries?
Yeah. And let me just say, when I've expected some pessimism about the possibility, but I think it's a possibility of creating a climate convention, climate refugee equivalent convention, it's not because I'm not trying, I don't want to recognize the many gaps in international law or the internet, but it's really a very pragmatic, my position is a very pragmatic one, which is I think it would be very difficult to get consensus on what that means at the current time. there's a literature that focuses on climate mobility, which is mobility justice, not climate justice. And scholars who argue the issue here is not about climate issue. It's the issue that we treat, migration is still the provenance of people who have some ability to move. It's still a very privileged thing to be able to do, even recognizing how impoverished or desperate survival migration usually is. And really what we need to do is think about not climate, but thinking about making mobility as a tool or a right to people, rather than focusing on the causes, whether it's persecution or climate or economic justice. So I thought that was a very interesting literature to sort of think about, uncouple it from climate. Maybe what we're really talking about is mobility justice. So just complexifying it for you even further. I apologize, I don't have fully formed answers, but I don't think we can have fully formed answers. I think I would like to see legal solutions and interventions that are really informed by the empirical and fieldwork literature. And that reflects actually my training as a physician, where you always want your data and your evidence to inform your interventions and your recommendations. And I certainly did not, I hope I did not in any way sort of minimize the importance of an ethical and normative framework for thinking about climate migration. I think it is fundamentally, I do think there are ethical obligations. I think operationalizing them is very challenging at the current time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prabhu. You've left us so much to think about, especially as we go on in our careers to who knows what area, since it's an issue that touches so many aspects of life. I'm sure that we can all really keep it in mind, no matter what path we end up taking, and understand the complexity of it. And maybe, who knows, we'll have something to contribute to the issue in the future based on all of our diverse.
Oh yeah, if you're interested, please do. And let me say, I loved my training at McGill. I enjoyed practicing law, but I've really found it very valuable and encourage you all to think about your other passions and think about coupling your legal skills and your knowledge of legal process at multiple levels. We tend to focus on national and international and in law school, but do not underestimate the importance of bringing legal expertise to what happens at the local, municipal, and regional, state, provincial level, because that's where some of the most important planning decisions take place. And bring your area of interest to law. So if you're on your way out and if you want to put in the chat what your particular interests are, it'd be sort of interesting to see who comes to these talks. And yes, certainly climate migration is big enough that there's space for anyone with any range of interests, from planning to environment to ethics to certainly health to social services. It is, migration is about people. So any aspect of peoplehood and developing communities will be relevant to thinking through issues around climate migration. Right, huge literature on thinking about what's called social protections and economic protections, including, income support to allow people to stay in their communities rather than to make the migration journey. So lots of interesting literature on development economics and allowing people to stay in circumstances where the environmental conditions are changing. All right, economic equity, environmental law, food security. So I apologize, food security is not by any means my area of expertise, but there's very interesting literature on food security, livestock, crops, and climate migration, which could be of interest.
Incredible.
Well,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say immigration law. Well, certainly international migration law, which I think has a sort of uneasy, sometimes relationship with international law. This is going to be a growth area. Yes, international justice, migrant refugee rights, corporate accountability. I didn't even get to really mention the possibilities for private sector engagement around responding to displaced persons and disasters. So,
Thank you
All
so
right.
much. Yes,
My
it's
pleasure,
been amazing,
everybody.
everyone.
Good luck with the rest of the semester and the rest of your legal time at McGill and beyond.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.